Security. This man is in my seat, and he's being threatening. The words exploded across the first-class cabin of Flight 847, like a grenade detonating in a library. Every passenger within earshot turned to stare at the woman shrieking at Gate A7, her manicured finger stabbing toward a black man sitting quietly in Seat 1, A, calmly reading a paperback book. But here's what nobody knew. Not the woman screaming, not the passengers filming, not even the flight crew rushing to intervene. In exactly 12 minutes, this woman would discover she had just tried to have the Secretary of Defense of the United States removed from an airplane. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, tell me where you're watching from. Comment your city below. And if you've ever witnessed injustice at 30,000 feet, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you're going to want to share this one. Now let's rewind to how this disaster began. The air inside the premium cabin of Flight 847, bound for London Heathrow from Los Angeles International Airport, carried the subtle scent of leather seats and expensive cologne. It was a sweltering Tuesday in July 2024, the kind of day where heat waves shimmered off the tarmac like liquid silver, making everyone irritable before they even stepped aboard. The woman causing the commotion was Vivian Blackwood, 52 years old and worth approximately $200 million, though she'd tell you it was more. She adjusted her oversized Tom Ford sunglasses despite being indoors, creating a barrier between herself and what she considered the common world. Vivian was a woman who wore wealth-like armor. Her platinum blonde bob was razor-sharp cut, weekly at a salon that charged more per hour than most people made in a month. Her Bottega Veneta handbag cost $30,000. Her Saint Laurent blazer was custom-tailored. Her patience was non-existent. She was the widow of real estate mogul Harrison Blackwood, a woman whose name graced hospital wings and museum galleries across Manhattan. She had never heard the word no without immediately demanding to speak to someone's supervisor. "Excuse me," she snapped at Brad Miller, the weary-looking gate agent checking boarding passes. "Why is this line moving so slowly? I paid $14,000 for this ticket, not for a standing room-only experience in a sauna." "We're just finishing pre-boarding for military personnel and passengers needing assistance," Ms. Blackwood, Brad said, his smile tight and practiced. He recognized her name from the manifest's VIP list. "We'll begin first-class boarding in exactly 90 seconds. Vivian huffed, rolling her eyes so dramatically she practically saw her own brain. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. "I have a board meeting in London." Time is money. When the boarding announcement finally came, Vivian elbowed past a young couple to be first down the jet bridge. She needed to be seated first. She needed her pre-flight champagne. She needed the world to acknowledge her arrival. She swept onto the plane, ignoring the flight attendant's greeting, and turned left into the sanctuary of the first-class cabin. It was an ultra-exclusive configuration, only 8 suites each, with a closing door, lie-flat bed, and massive entertainment screen. This was her kingdom, or it should have been. Vivian stopped dead in her tracks. Her seat was 1K on the right side of the aisle, but her eyes were immediately drawn to seat 1A, directly across from hers. Sitting there was a man who, in her narrow worldview, looked entirely wrong. Marcus Thompson, though she didn't know his name yet, was an African-American man in his late 40s. He was dressed simply a navy blue hoodie from what appeared to be a university dark denim jeans that looked well worn but clean and pristine white Air Jordan sneakers. He had a pair of noise-canceling headphones around his neck and was quietly reading a thick paperback book with a cracked spine. The book was The Art of War by Sun Tzu, though Vivian couldn't see the title from her angle. Marcus looked comfortable, relaxed, and completely absorbed in his reading. In Vivian's prejudiced mind, this equation did not compute. Hoodie plus jeans plus sneakers plus black man did not equal $14,000 first-class international seat. In her world, this equaled staff upgrade, frequent flyer miles, or worse. She marched over to her seat, tossed her handbag down with a heavy thud that echoed through the cabin, and remained standing. She stared at him, expecting some kind of reaction, some acknowledgement of her superiority. Marcus didn't look up. Vivian cleared her throat loudly. "Marcus!" Vivian cleared her throat loudly. Marcus didn't move. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the soft jazz music playing over the cabin speakers like a rusty blade through silk. Marcus blinked slowly, marked his page with his finger, and looked up. His eyes were calm, dark, and intelligent. There was depth there, the kind that comes from seeing too much of the world, both its beauty and its ugliness. He slid his headphones off his neck and placed them on the side table. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was deep, articulate, and unfailingly polite. "Can I help you with something?" But Vivian didn't hear politeness. She heard audacity. She heard a black man who didn't immediately defer to her obvious superiority. "You're in the wrong seat," she stated flatly, pointing a manicured finger toward the economy section behind them. "The back of the plane is that way." Marcus looked down at his boarding pass, then back at her. A small, confused smile played at the corners of his lips. "I believe I'm in the correct seat, ma'am. 1A. "Don't play games with me," Vivian hissed, leaning forward. Her perfume, something heavy and floral that cost more per ounce than gold, wafted over him. "I know how this works. You saw an empty seat and thought you could sneak up here before the real passenger arrived. Well, I'm here now, and I'm watching you. Get up." The man's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of weary patience. It was an expression he'd worn too many times in his life. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I have a valid ticket for this seat. I'm not sneaking anywhere. Let me see it," she demanded, holding out her hand like she was entitled to inspect his documents. "I don't think I need to show you my ticket," Marcus said, his voice remaining calm. "I've already shown it to the gate agent and the flight crew." "Because it's fake." Vivian's voice rose to a shrill pitch, attracting the attention of other first-class passengers who were filtering in. A tech entrepreneur in seat 2B and a famous fashion blogger in 2K were both watching with wide eyes, their phones subtly positioned to capture whatever was about to unfold. "You clearly used miles, or you're an employee using a buddy pass. And let me tell you something," Vivian continued, her voice getting louder. "Buddy pass riders are the first to be kicked off when paying customers have an issue. And I have a big issue." Marcus closed his book slowly. He took a deep breath, the kind a person takes when they're deciding whether to engage with ignorance or simply endure it. "I suggest you sit down, ma'am," he said quietly. "The flight attendants are trying to serve beverages." "Don't you dare tell me what to do!" Vivian shrieked, her composure completely shattered. "I paid full fare. Do you know who I am? I am Vivian Blackwood. My husband built half the luxury developments in Manhattan. I will not sit across from a person like you who thinks he owns the place." Elena Vasquez, a 28-year-old flight attendant with kind eyes and an Army medic background, hurried over with a bottle of Dom Perignon in her hand. She looked panic-stricken, her professional smile wavering. "Ms. Blackwood," Elena said carefully, "is there a problem?" "Yes, there's a problem." "Elena," Vivian said, reading the name tag and pointing a trembling finger at Marcus. "This man is in the wrong seat. He's aggressive, he's rude, and he refuses to show me his ticket. I want him removed immediately." Elena looked at Marcus. For a split second, her eyes widened slightly. There was a flicker of recognition or perhaps surprise crossing her face. She looked back at Vivian. "Ms. Blackwood." "Elena," said her voice dropping to a whisper, "please take your seat. This gentleman is listed on our manifest. He's in the correct seat. Check again." Vivian slammed her hand on the suite wall. "Look at him. Look at what he's wearing. Does he look like he paid $14,000? He's probably a drug dealer or a rapper spending dirty money, and I will not feel safe sleeping next to him for 8 hours. The cabin went deadly silent. The racism wasn't subtle anymore. It was raw, ugly, and impossible to ignore. Marcus didn't yell. He didn't stand up to intimidate her physically. He simply looked at Elena and said, "Elena, isn't it? Could you please get me a sparkling water with lime and perhaps a towel for the lady? She seems to be overheating." Vivian gasped like he'd slapped her. "You arrogant Elena, get your supervisor. Get the captain. I want this man off this plane immediately. I am a Diamond Medallion member. I demand you check his credentials properly." Elena looked torn. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod that somehow conveyed both permission and reassurance. "I'll get the lead flight attendant." Elena stammered. "Please, Ms. Blackwood, take your seat." But Vivian didn't sit. She stood over Marcus, her shadow looming over him like a storm cloud. "You picked the wrong woman to mess with," she sneered. "I'm going to have you in handcuffs before the wheels even leave the ground." Marcus reopened his book calmly. "We'll see," he said. The tension in the first-class cabin was so thick it felt like the air pressure had dropped. Other passengers were frantically texting, likely broadcasting the drama to friends or social media. But nobody dared intervene directly. Vivian Blackwood was a force of nature, a destructive hurricane of entitlement, and no one wanted to be in her path. Minutes passed like hours. The other passengers settled into their seats, but the atmosphere remained electric. Vivian continued to pace near Marcus's seat, muttering under her breath about people like him and security threats, and what this world is coming to. Finally, the lead flight attendant arrived. Captain Rodriguez himself followed close behind his face, grim with the kind of expression that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Captain Eduardo Rodriguez was a 45-year-old veteran pilot with 20 years in commercial aviation and 8 years in the Air Force before that. He had silver streaks in his black hair and the kind of steady presence that made passengers feel safe even in turbulence. He had dealt with drunk celebrities, medical emergencies, and unruly passengers, but nothing irritated him more than watching someone abuse another human being on his aircraft. "What seems to be the issue here?" Rodriguez asked, his posture rigid, his voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded a $150 million aircraft. "The issue," Vivian spat, finally taking a step back, but keeping her glare fixed on Marcus, "is that this airline has lowered its standards to the point of criminal negligence. I am telling you, Captain, this man is a security threat." "A security threat." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. He looked at Marcus, who was currently cleaning his glasses with a microfiber cloth. "In what way, Ms. Blackwood?" "He's belligerent." Vivian lied effortlessly, the words flowing like she'd rehearsed them. "He threatened me when I politely asked him to check his seat assignment. He told me to watch my back and that I'd regret crossing him." Marcus sighed deeply. It was a heavy sound filled with the exhaustion of a man who'd heard these same lies in different forms his entire life. "I said nothing of the sort," he replied quietly. "Liar!" Vivian screamed, her voice echoing through the cabin. "See? He's calling me a liar right to your face. I want his bag searched, Captain. I guarantee you'll find something. Look at that hoodie, you can hide anything in there. Weapons, drugs, fake documents. I refuse to fly until he's been properly vetted by security." 24-year-old Sophie Martinez, a social media influencer with 2 million Instagram followers, had been discreetly filming from seat 2F. She was a petite woman with large, expressive eyes and the kind of authentic presence that had made her famous for calling out injustice. Her phone was positioned perfectly to capture the entire interaction. She opened Instagram Live. "Hey everyone. Sophie here," she whispered into her phone. "I'm on a flight to London, and you are not going to believe what's happening right now. There's a woman here completely going off on this black man who's literally just sitting in his seat reading a book. The viewer count started climbing immediately. 500 viewers, 1,000, 2,500. James Patterson, the 29-year-old tech entrepreneur in 2B, was getting increasingly uncomfortable. He kept looking around, clearly wanting to say something, but unsure how to intervene. He was the founder of a diversity-focused startup, someone who talked a good game about equality in Silicon Valley boardrooms, but here faced with real racism in real time, he was frozen. Rodriguez studied Marcus carefully. There was something about the man that seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. The way he carried himself, the quiet confidence, the sense that he was accustomed to being in charge. Sir Rodriguez said to Marcus, "Did you threaten this passenger?" "No, Captain Rodriguez," Marcus replied, and something in the way he said the captain's name made Rodriguez's eyes narrow slightly. The tone was respectful but familiar, like he was used to dealing with military officers. "He knows your name," Vivian pointed accusingly. "See, he's been studying the crew manifest. This is stalking behavior. This is terrifying, Captain. Look at me, I'm shaking." She was indeed shaking, but it was from rage and adrenaline, not fear. Ms. Blackwood Rodriguez said his patience, clearly wearing thin. "I cannot remove a passenger based on speculation. He has a valid boarding pass. He's cleared TSA security. Unless he commits a specific act of violence or non-compliance, he stays." Vivian's face turned a shade of crimson that clashed violently with her Saint Laurent blazer. She reached into her handbag and pulled out her iPhone 14 Pro Max in a gold case that probably cost more than most people's rent. "Fine," she hissed. "If you won't do your job, I'll call someone who will. My brother-in-law is a regional director for the TSA. I have executives from 3 major airlines on speed dial. I am going to make calls, and when I'm done, you'll be grounded, Elena will be fired, and this thug will be in federal custody." She began tapping furiously on her phone, her acrylic nails clicking against the screen like an angry woodpecker. Marcus finally turned his body fully toward her. For the first time, his expression hardened slightly. The softness in his eyes evaporated, replaced by something steelier, more commanding. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming more authoritative. "I strongly suggest you do not make that call. You are digging a hole you won't be able to climb out of. Sit down, enjoy your champagne, and let us all get to London peacefully. Are you threatening me again?" Vivian laughed, a manic, high-pitched sound that made other passengers wince. "Oh, you're scared now. You know I have connections. You know you're a fraud." She put the phone to her ear. "Yes, this is Vivian Blackwood. Get me Director Reynolds immediately. It's an emergency at LAX Gate A7. I have a security breach on aircraft 847. She paused, listening, then glared at Marcus. "Yes, a suspicious male. He's urban aggressive, refusing crew instructions. I believe he may be intoxicated or on drugs. I want Port Authority here immediately." Sophie's live stream was exploding. The viewer count had hit 15,000 and was climbing fast. "You guys," she whispered to her phone, "this woman is completely losing it. She's making false reports to security about this man who's literally done nothing but read his book. The comments are going crazy. Some of you are saying you recognize him, but I can't see his face clearly from this angle." The comments were indeed going wild. "OMG, is that who I think it is? Someone needs to stop this racist woman. This is about to blow up in her face. I think I know who that is." But Sophie couldn't read them all fast enough to understand what her followers were trying to tell her. Vivian hung up and crossed her arms, a smug smile plastering her face. "They're coming. Port Authority Police, TSA, possibly FBI. You're finished." Elena approached Marcus hesitantly. "Sir, I'm so sorry about this disruption. Can I call the captain back to speak with you privately?" "No," Marcus said, raising his hand gently. "Let her play this out completely." "But Elena..." He looked at her with eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Tell Captain Rodriguez not to take off yet. We're going to be delayed. And tell him Eagle 1 is having a situation in the cabin." Elena's eyes went wide as dinner plates. Her hand flew to her mouth and she gasped audibly. "Eagle 1, sir. Are you—" "Just tell him," Marcus said quietly. Vivian completely missed this exchange. She was too busy texting her wealthy friends, boasting about how she was taking out the trash in first class and making air travel safe again. She felt powerful, righteous, completely in control. She had no idea she was about to become the most hated woman on the internet. 10 minutes passed. The plane should have pushed back from the gate by now, but it remained stationary. Captain Rodriguez announced over the intercom that there would be a slight delay due to a passenger services issue which caused groans throughout the economy cabin. The first-class cabin, however, was dead silent except for the soft clicking of phones recording and the occasional whispered commentary from Sophie's live stream. "We're at 25,000 viewers now," Sophie whispered into her phone. "I've never had this many people watching live before." The woman called airport security on this man who's literally just sitting here. He seems super calm about it, which honestly makes me think she's completely in the wrong. Then came the sound everyone had been waiting for, the heavy thumping of boots on the jet bridge. Vivian beamed like she'd just won the lottery. Finally. 3 Port Authority police officers boarded the aircraft. They were large, imposing men with tactical vests and grim expressions that suggested they'd been dealing with airport nonsense all day and were thoroughly tired of it. Officer Rodriguez, no relation to the captain, was the lead, a 15-year veteran with graying temples and the weary look of a man who'd seen every kind of human stupidity imaginable. Behind him were Officers Kim and Washington, both younger, but equally unimpressed with whatever they were about to encounter. "Who called this?" Officer Rodriguez asked, scanning the cabin with professional skepticism. Vivian waved her hand like she was hailing a taxi in Manhattan. "Over here, officer. Thank God you're here." She stood up, smoothing her blazer, preparing to deliver her performance. "That man," she pointed her manicured finger at Marcus like she was identifying a suspect in a lineup, "is a danger to this flight. He threatened me multiple times. He's likely armed. He has no business being in first class, and I demand you remove him immediately." The officers looked at Vivian, then at Marcus. Marcus remained seated, his hands resting calmly on his knees, his expression completely neutral. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a college professor waiting for a bus. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. He'd been doing this job long enough to spot the real troublemakers, and nothing about the quiet man in the hoodie set off any alarm bells. The hysterical woman in designer clothes, however, was pinging his radar hard. "Ma'am," he said in the flat professional tone cops use when they're already annoyed. "Did you see a weapon?" "Well, no, but look at him," Vivian stammered, gesturing wildly at Marcus. "He's wearing a hoodie. He fits the profile. He's suspicious. Just get his ID and run his name. You'll see he has a criminal record. I guarantee it." Officer Rodriguez sighed deeply. He'd been called to situations like this before, usually involving racial profiling and false accusations. He turned to Marcus. "Sir, I apologize for this disruption. Do you mind showing me some identification?" "I don't mind at all," Marcus said. He reached slowly into his back pocket, moving deliberately so no one could claim he was making threatening gestures. "Watch out! He's reaching!" Vivian shrieked, diving dramatically behind her seat like she was taking cover from sniper fire. The officers didn't flinch. They watched calmly as Marcus pulled out a slim black leather wallet. But instead of pulling out a driver's license, he opened the wallet and removed a black leather badge case and a heavy metallic ID card with an official government seal and a gold security chip. He handed both items to Officer Rodriguez. Rodriguez took the credentials. He looked at them casually. At first, then his eyes widened. He squinted, looked at Marcus, then back at the ID. His entire posture changed instantly, straightening from bored cop to respectful subordinate. "Oh," Rodriguez said, his voice suddenly tight. "Oh, wow. Sir, I had no idea. Is he a criminal?" Vivian popped her head up, gleeful anticipation written across her face. "Is he wanted? What did he do?" Officer Rodriguez ignored her completely. He handed the credentials back to Marcus with both hands, almost reverentially. "My sincere apologies, sir," he said. "We had no idea you were traveling today. Is this passenger bothering you? Because if so, we can handle this immediately." Vivian's jaw dropped so hard it practically hit the airplane floor. "Excuse me," she screeched. "Bothering him. I am the victim here. Why aren't you arresting him? What is happening?" Officer Rodriguez turned to Vivian, and his expression had completely transformed. Where before there had been professional patience, now there was barely controlled irritation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hard as concrete, "you need to understand something. You have just filed a false police report. You've wasted the time of 3 officers, disrupted an international flight, and made accusations against someone who—" He glanced at Marcus, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Someone who has every right to be exactly where he is?" Rodriguez finished diplomatically. "False report." Vivian's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Who is this man? Why are you protecting him?" "What aren't you telling me, ma'am? I'm not protecting anyone because I want to," Rodriguez said. "I'm treating this gentleman with the respect he's earned. And frankly, you are the only person on this aircraft who's been disruptive, threatening, and out of line." James Patterson, who had been silent throughout the entire ordeal, finally found his voice. "Officers," he said, standing up from his seat, "I've been sitting here this whole time. That man hasn't done anything except read his book and respond politely to her accusations. She's been screaming at him for 20 minutes. I demand to speak to the captain," Vivian yelled, losing all semblance of control. "Get the pilot out here. I am not flying with this person and these corrupt police officers. I want answers." Sophie's live stream had exploded to 50,000 viewers. The comments were scrolling so fast she couldn't read them, but the few she caught were explosive. "Someone tell her who he is. This is about to be legendary. She has no idea what's coming. Vivian, Blackwood is about to learn today." The cockpit door buzzed and clicked open with an electronic sound that somehow felt ominous. "You don't need to shout." A deep voice boomed from the front of the aircraft. I heard everything. Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit, and his expression was unlike anything the passengers had ever seen from an airline captain. His face was stone-cold serious, but his eyes were blazing with controlled fury. He walked directly past Vivian, ignoring her completely, and stopped in front of seat 1A. The captain looked at Marcus, and something passed between them, a recognition, a shared understanding that went deeper than civilian life. Then, to Vivian's absolute shock, and the astonishment of everyone watching Sophie's live stream, Captain Rodriguez straightened to attention and delivered a crisp, sharp military salute to the man in the hoodie. "Mr. Secretary," the captain said, clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the cabin, "it is an honor to have you aboard, sir." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the gentle hum of the aircraft's air conditioning system and the soft ping of Sophie's phone notifications as her follower count exploded. Vivian felt like the world had just tilted off its axis. "Mr. Secretary," she whispered the words barely audible. Marcus Thompson slowly stood up for the first time since boarding. He wasn't tall, maybe 5'10", but somehow his presence filled the entire cabin. He looked at Captain Rodriguez and nodded slightly. "Thank you, Captain, though I was hoping to travel quietly today." "Secretary of what?" Vivian demanded, her voice shrill with panic. Secretary of what department? Marcus turned to face her directly for the first time. When their eyes met, Vivian felt a chill run down her spine. These weren't the eyes of someone she could intimidate or dismiss. These were the eyes of someone who was used to making decisions that affected millions of lives. Ma'am, Marcus said quietly, "I am Marcus Thompson. I am the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. Sophie's phone screen was going absolutely insane. 75,000 viewers and climbing. Comments flooding in faster than she could process. Oh my God, it's really him she's so screwed, Secretary of Defense. This is going to be everywhere. She just racially profiled the S-E-C-D-E-F. Vivian stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, her brain desperately trying to process information that didn't compute with her world view. That's impossible, she finally managed. You're wearing a hoodie. You're black, Marcus asked quietly. Is that what you're trying to say, Ms. Blackwood? The use of her name made her take a step backward. How did he know her name? When had she told him her name? The Secretary of Defense. She said, her voice getting smaller. Wears a uniform. Has security. Travels on government planes. Usually, yes, Marcus agreed. But today is my first day off in 8 months. I'm flying to London to visit my daughter and meet my new grandson. I dressed for comfort because I didn't think I needed to prove my worth to strangers on an airplane. He paused, letting that sink in. I didn't realize that in America in 2024, a black man needed to wear a suit and tie to be treated with basic human dignity. The weight of what had happened was finally crashing down on Vivian like an avalanche. She had just spent half an hour screaming at making false accusations about and trying to have arrested the Secretary of Defense of the United States. But Vivian Blackwood didn't back down. That was her superpower and her fatal flaw. Instead of apologizing, instead of recognizing her mistake, she doubled down. I don't care if you're the president himself, she said, her voice cracking. You were dressed inappropriately. You were misleading passengers. You should have identified yourself. This is entrapment. The cabin erupted in gasps. Even some of the economy passengers had gathered at the edge of first class to watch the spectacle drawn by the commotion and the whispered rumors spreading throughout the plane. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward again. Ma'am, that is enough. The secretary doesn't owe you an explanation for his choice of clothing. He doesn't owe you proof of his identity. And he certainly doesn't owe you an apology for existing in a space you think he doesn't belong. This isn't over, Vivian said, but her voice had lost its commanding edge. She sounded desperate now, cornered. My lawyers will hear about this. The airline will hear about this. The media will hear about this. Marcus smiled for the first time since the ordeal began, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how this story was going to end. Ms. Blackwood, he said quietly, the media is already hearing about this. He gestured toward Sophie, whose phone was clearly visible, the red live indicator glowing like a warning light. 87,000 people are currently watching this conversation, Marcus said, and I suspect that number is about to get much, much larger. Vivian's blood turned to ice water in her veins as she realized that her worst nightmare was already happening. Sophie Martinez had started her live stream as a casual travel vlog, expecting maybe a few hundred viewers to tune in as she documented her trip to London Fashion Week. She never expected to become the primary broadcaster of what was rapidly becoming the most viral moment of 2024. You guys, she whispered into her phone, trying to keep her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. I cannot believe what I'm witnessing right now. This woman just spent 30 minutes trying to get the Secretary of Defense arrested because she thought he looked suspicious. The viewer count was climbing exponentially 87,000, 95,000, 110,000. Her phone was getting hot from the processing power required to handle the stream, and the comments were scrolling so fast they were just a blur of outrage and disbelief. "Wait, let me try to read some of your comments," Sophie said, squinting at her screen. Okay, someone's saying, "Get her name and employer." Someone else is saying, "This needs to go to the news." Oh my God. Someone found her. LinkedIn. Vivian Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Properties. Vivian, who is standing frozen in the aisle like a deer caught in headlights, heard her name being broadcast to over 100,000 people and felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. "Turn that off," she demanded, lurching toward Sophie. "Turn that camera off right now. I did not consent to be filmed." Ma'am, Officer Kim interjected, stepping between Vivian and Sophie. "You're on an airplane. There's no expectation of privacy, and the young lady has every right to document what she's witnessing." Elena, the flight attendant, had been standing in the galley watching everything unfold with growing horror. She'd recognized Marcus Thompson the moment he'd boarded. Her brother was a Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton, and he'd shown her photos of the new Secretary of Defense when he was appointed 6 months ago. She'd spent the entire confrontation wanting to speak up, but being bound by professional protocols about passenger privacy. Now that his identity was public, those restrictions no longer applied. "Mr. Secretary," Elena said, approaching with visible emotion, "I want to personally apologize for what you've endured on this aircraft. This is not representative of our crew or our airline's values." Marcus turned to her with genuine warmth. "Elena, you handled yourself professionally in an impossible situation. Thank you." "Actually, Sir," Elena said, glancing nervously at Vivian, "there's something I think you should know about Ms. Blackwood's company." Vivian's eyes widened in panic. "Elena, whatever you think you know, my brother is stationed at Camp Pendleton." Elena continued, ignoring Vivian's interruption. "He lives in base housing built by Blackwood Properties 3 years ago. There have been issues. Mold, electrical problems, heating failures in winter. The housing quality has been a major concern among the enlisted families." Marcus's expression darkened slightly. This was the first he was hearing about ongoing problems with Blackwood Properties, but it aligned with some concerning reports that had been filtering up through the chain of command. "I see," he said quietly. "Thank you for sharing that information, Elena." Vivian felt like she was sinking in quicksand. Every word Elena spoke was making her situation worse, and now her company's military contracts, the foundation of her entire fortune, were being discussed in front of over 130,000 live viewers. James Patterson, the tech entrepreneur who had remained largely silent until now, finally stood up from his seat. His startup, focused on bias detection in hiring algorithms and watching Vivian's behavior, had triggered every anti-discrimination instinct he possessed. "I'm sorry, but I can't stay quiet anymore," James announced to the cabin. "I've been sitting here for 30 minutes watching this woman make assumptions about a fellow passenger based solely on his race and clothing. This is exactly the kind of unconscious bias that we spend billions trying to eliminate from corporate America." He turned to his phone and opened his own social media. "I'm James Patterson, founder of Bias Check AI. I'm currently witnessing a textbook example of racial profiling at 30,000 feet. The woman in question just discovered she's been harassing the Secretary of Defense." Within minutes, James's post was being shared across LinkedIn, Twitter, and TikTok. His company's corporate account retweeted it, adding, "Bias doesn't take a vacation. Neither should justice." Vivian watched in horror as her humiliation spread across multiple platforms simultaneously. "Stop," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please, everyone, just stop. This is a private matter." "Ma'am," Captain Rodriguez said firmly, "you made this a public matter the moment you started screaming accusations in my cabin. You involved law enforcement, disrupted my flight, and made false claims about a passenger. This stopped being private 30 minutes ago. Sophie's live stream had reached 150,000 viewers, and the hashtags were already trending: Vivian Blackwood, Secretary of Defense, First Class, Racism, Karma at 30,000 justice served. The comments were a mix of outrage, schadenfreude, and calls for accountability. Someone needs to check her company's government contracts. This woman represents everything wrong with entitled wealth. How many other people has she treated this way? Cancel every deal with Blackwood Properties. The secretary handled this with such grace. While the social media storm raged around them, the 3 Port Authority officers were conducting their own assessment of the situation. Officer Rodriguez had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when someone had made a catastrophic error in judgment. "Ms. Blackwood," he said, consulting his notepad, "you called in a report claiming this gentleman was threatening, potentially armed, and suspicious. You also claimed he threatened you personally. Is that correct?" Yes, but I didn't know," Ma'am Rodriguez interrupted. "Ignorance of someone's identity doesn't excuse filing a false police report. Did you see him commit any crime? Did you see any weapons? Did you hear him actually threaten you?" Vivian's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. He told me I would regret this, after you had already accused him of fraud and called for his removal," Officer Kim pointed out. "That sounds like a prediction, not a threat." Officer Washington had been taking notes throughout the entire exchange, documenting everything for his report. "Ma'am, based on witness statements and what we've observed, it appears you made assumptions about this passenger based on his appearance and race. That's not only morally wrong, it's potentially criminal under federal hate crime statutes." The words hate crime hit Vivian like a physical blow. She grabbed onto the nearest seat back for support. "I'm not a racist," she protested weakly. "I donate to charities. I support diversity causes. I just thought—" "You thought what, exactly?" Marcus asked quietly. He had remained seated throughout most of the investigation, but his presence dominated the conversation nonetheless. I thought someone who looked like you didn't belong in first class." Vivian admitted the words coming out in a whisper. The honesty of the statement hit everyone in the cabin like a thunderclap. She had finally said out loud what everyone already knew she was thinking. "And why did you think that Ms. Blackwood?" Marcus pressed gently. Vivian couldn't answer. Any response would have been an admission of the racial prejudice that had driven her behavior from the moment she saw him. Elena stepped forward again. "Mr. Secretary, if I may, I'd like to share something else about Mrs. Blackwood's company." Marcus nodded for her to continue. "When I was stationed at Fort Bragg before joining the airline, I worked part-time for a contractor doing housing inspections. Blackwood Properties was repeatedly cited for using substandard materials in enlisted housing. There were complaints about discrimination in their hiring practices, too specifically regarding minority contractors. This was new information to Marcus, and it painted a troubling pattern. Personal bias translating into business practices that affected military families under his responsibility. "Elena," he said, "would you be willing to provide a formal statement about these issues when we land?" "Absolutely, sir." Vivian felt the walls closing in around her. Her personal humiliation was bad enough, but now the integrity of her business was being questioned in front of hundreds of thousands of viewers. "Mr. Secretary," she said desperately, "surely we can handle this privately. My company has served the military faithfully for decades." "One misunderstanding on an airplane doesn't—" Ms. Blackwood Marcus interrupted. "This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a revelation. You've shown me exactly who you are and how you think. And if this is how you treat people in public when you think no one important is watching, I can only imagine how you operate in private." Captain Rodriguez had been monitoring the situation while also trying to manage the logistics of his delayed flight. He'd received multiple calls from airline headquarters demanding to know why Flight 847 was still at the gate and what was causing the social media firestorm that was rapidly becoming a PR nightmare for the company. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced over the cabin intercom, "we're going to be delayed approximately 30 more minutes while we resolve a passenger services issue. I apologize for the inconvenience." The announcement was met with groans from economy class, but most passengers were already aware of what was happening. News of the confrontation had spread throughout the aircraft via text messages and social media posts from passengers who were following the live stream. Marcus's phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from his chief of staff, the Pentagon, and various government officials who had been alerted to the viral incident. He'd been ignoring them, but he finally checked one message from his assistant. "Sir, the video has been picked up by CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and BBC. The White House Communications Office is asking for guidance on response. Please advise." Marcus showed the message to Captain Rodriguez. "I think it's time we wrap this up, Captain," agreed Mr. Secretary. "What would you like me to do about Ms. Blackwood?" Marcus looked at Vivian, who was slumped in her seat frantically texting someone, probably her lawyers or PR team. She looked smaller now, diminished by the weight of her own actions. "I want to offer her a choice," Marcus said. "A choice?" Vivian looked up, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since learning his identity. "Yes," Marcus said, standing up and facing her directly. "You can sit down, remain silent for the duration of this flight, and when we land in London, you can face whatever consequences await you there. Or, what Vivian asked desperately, or you can get off this plane right now, issue a public apology for your behavior, and commit to making changes in both your personal conduct and your business practices." Vivian stared at him. "If I get off the plane, I'll miss my board meeting. There are billion-dollar contracts at stake." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, there are, including several with the Department of Defense." The implication hung in the air like a sword over her head. Vivian suddenly understood that this wasn't just about her personal humiliation. Her entire business empire was at risk. "Mr. Secretary," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that your behavior today has given me serious concerns about your fitness to hold government contracts," Marcus replied calmly. "Character matters. Ms. Blackwood, leadership matters. The way you treat people when you think you have power over them tells me everything I need to know about how you run your business." Sophie's live stream was still running now, with over 200,000 viewers. The comments were a mix of calls for justice and disbelief at what they were witnessing. Is he really threatening her contracts? This is the most epic karma moment ever. She brought this on herself. Power recognizes power, and she has none. Vivian looked around the cabin, desperately seeking support from someone, anyone. But every face she saw reflected disgust, disappointment, or schadenfreude. Even the Port Authority officers were looking at her with barely concealed disdain. I didn't mean," she began, but the words died in her throat. Ms. Blackwood, Marcus said quietly, "The time for explanations is over. Make your choice. Stay and face the consequences, or leave and begin making amends. Either way, your company's relationship with the Department of Defense is going to change." The weight of that statement hit everyone in the cabin. This wasn't just personal anymore. It was about billions of dollars, hundreds of jobs, and the housing conditions of thousands of military families. Vivian closed her eyes, trying to process the impossible choice she was being given. Everything she'd built, everything she'd inherited, everything she thought she controlled was slipping away, because she couldn't see past the color of a man's skin. When she opened her eyes again, Marcus was still watching her with that calm, patient expression that somehow made her feel smaller than any angry shouting could have. What "What would happen to my company if I got off the plane?" she asked, weakly. "That depends," Marcus replied, "on what you do next." The first-class cabin of Flight 847 had become an amphitheater for one of the most dramatic reversals of power in aviation history. Every passenger, every crew member, even the Port Authority officers were holding their breath, waiting to see what Vivian Blackwood would do with the impossible choice she'd been given. Sophie's live stream had exploded beyond all expectations. 250,000 viewers were watching in real time as one of the most powerful women in Manhattan real estate faced the consequences of her prejudice. The comments were flooding in so fast that Sophie had given up trying to read them, but the hashtags were already trending worldwide. Secretary of Defense was #1 globally. Vivian Blackwood was #2. Karma Flight was #3. "I can't believe what I'm witnessing," Sophie whispered to her phone. "This woman has gone from attacking a passenger to potentially losing billions of dollars in government contracts. This is the most insane flight I've ever been on." Vivian sat frozen in her seat. Her designer clothes wrinkled her perfect makeup streaked with sweat and tears she didn't remember crying. The magnitude of her situation was finally sinking in. She wasn't just facing social media humiliation, she was facing the complete destruction of her business empire. "Mr. Secretary," she said, her voice hoarse from shouting earlier, if I choose to get off this plane, what exactly would you expect from me?" Marcus remained standing, his presence somehow filling the entire cabin despite his casual clothing. "I would expect 3 things, Ms. Blackwood. First, a genuine public apology, not to me, but to every service member and their family who has been affected by your company's substandard work. Second, an immediate internal audit of your business practices, with a focus on quality control and fair contracting. Third, a personal commitment to diversity training and cultural competency education." "And if I do all that?" Vivian asked desperately. "Then perhaps we can discuss your company's future with the Department of Defense," Marcus replied. "But understand this, your contracts will never again be approved based on legacy relationships or political connections. They'll be earned through demonstrated quality, integrity, and accountability." James Patterson, who had been documenting everything on his own social media, spoke up from his seat. "Mr. Secretary, if I may, I think the public deserves to know what this woman's company has been doing with taxpayer money." Marcus nodded slowly. "You're right, James. Transparency matters." He turned back to Vivian. "Ms. Blackwood, your company currently holds approximately $2.8 billion in active Department of Defense contracts. Your projects include housing for enlisted families at Camp Pendleton, Fort Bragg, Fort Hood, and 12 other installations. Based on the information I've received today and given what I've witnessed of your character, I have serious concerns about the quality and management of these projects." The cabin went completely silent except for the gentle hum of the aircraft systems and the soft notification sounds from Sophie's phone as her follower count continued to explode. Elena Marcus continued, "You mentioned issues at multiple installations. Can you be more specific?" Elena glanced nervously at Vivian, then straightened her shoulders. "Yes, sir. The housing at Camp Pendleton has had ongoing problems with mold electrical issues and poor insulation. Families have complained about heating failures in winter and cooling failures in summer. There have been reports of children developing respiratory issues from the mold problems." Marcus's expression darkened. "And these issues were reported to Blackwood Properties multiple times, sir. The complaints were either ignored or addressed with superficial fixes that didn't solve the underlying problems." Vivian felt like she was drowning. Every word Elena spoke was another nail in the coffin of her business empire, and it was all being broadcast to hundreds of thousands of people. "Mr. Secretary." "Those reports are exaggerated," she protested weakly. "Every construction project has minor issues. We've addressed concerns as they've arisen." "Minor issues." Marcus's voice carried a sharp edge for the first time. "Ms. Blackwood, These are the homes of people who serve our country. These are families who sacrifice for America's security. There is no such thing as a minor issue when it affects their quality of life. Captain Rodriguez, who had been monitoring the situation while also dealing with increasingly frantic calls from airline executives, stepped forward again. "Mr. Secretary, we need to make a decision about this flight. We're already 45 minutes behind schedule, and I have 200 passengers who need to get to London." Marcus nodded. "You're right, Captain." "Ms. Blackwood, I need your decision now." Vivian looked around the cabin one more time. Every face was watching her, waiting to see what she would do. The Port Authority officers were clearly hoping she would choose to leave so they could close this incident without arresting anyone. The passengers were watching like spectators at a tennis match, their phones out, documenting every moment. "This isn't fair," Vivian said, suddenly, her voice rising again. "I made a mistake, yes, but this is disproportionate. You're destroying my life over one incident." One incident. James Patterson stood up from his seat, his calm demeanor finally cracking. "Ma'am, you spent 30 minutes making racist assumptions about a fellow passenger. You filed false police reports. You tried to have an innocent man arrested because of his skin color. This isn't one incident. This is who you are." "I am not a racist," Vivian shouted, her composure completely shattered now. "I employ hundreds of people. I donate millions to charity. I support diversity programs." And yet Marcus said quietly, "The moment you saw a black man in first class, your first assumption was that he didn't belong there. You didn't consider that he might be a business executive, a doctor, a veteran, or a public servant. You saw his skin color and made a judgment." Sophie's viewers had climbed past 300,000, and the mainstream media was starting to pick up the story in real time. Her phone was buzzing with interview requests from major networks. "You guys," Sophie whispered to her stream, "I'm getting calls from CNN and MSNBC. This story is going everywhere. I think we're witnessing something that's going to change how people think about air travel and discrimination." Officer Rodriguez checked his watch. "Ma'am, we need a decision. Either you're coming with us to file a report about your false accusations, or you're staying on this plane and dealing with the consequences in London. But this situation ends now." Vivian's phone rang. The caller ID showed her chief legal counsel. She answered it with shaking hands. "Vivian, where are you?" Her lawyer's voice was tense and urgent. "The internet is exploding. Your board of directors is calling an emergency meeting. The stock is in free fall. You need to get ahead of this story immediately." "I'm still on the plane," Vivian whispered, acutely aware that hundreds of thousands of people could hear her conversation through the live stream. "Get off that plane right now," her lawyer commanded. "We need to do damage control before this gets any worse." "It's the Secretary of Defense," Vivian said helplessly. "He's threatening our government contracts." There was a long pause. "He's what Vivian, please tell me you didn't attack the Secretary of Defense." "I didn't know who he was," Vivian protested. "He was dressed like a normal person on vacation," her lawyer finished. "Vivian, you need to apologize immediately and publicly. This could bankrupt the company." Marcus, who could hear the entire conversation, stepped forward. "Ms. Blackwood, your lawyer is giving you good advice. The question is whether you're willing to take it." Vivian hung up her phone and looked at Marcus with a mixture of fear and desperate calculation. "Mr. Secretary, if I do what you're asking, the apology, the audit, the training, can you guarantee my company will survive?" "I can't guarantee anything," Marcus replied honestly. "What I can tell you is that your current path leads to certain destruction. The alternative path requires genuine change, but it offers the possibility of redemption. There's something else you should know." Marcus continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "About the connection between us." Vivian frowned. "Connection. We've never met before." "No, we haven't. But 3 years ago, a young architecture student applied for an internship at your company. Her name was Maya Thompson. Vivian's blood turned cold. She remembered that name. She remembered specifically rejecting that application, not because the candidate wasn't qualified, but because she didn't fit the company culture. "Maya is my daughter," Marcus said quietly. She graduated summa cum laude from MIT with a degree in civil engineering. She spoke 5 languages and had already published research on sustainable military housing, but you rejected her application without even an interview. The color drained from Vivian's face. We receive hundreds of applications." "You wrote not a cultural fit on her rejection letter?" Marcus continued. Maya kept that letter. She said it motivated her to prove that excellence speaks for itself regardless of prejudice. Sophie's stream was going absolutely insane. Over 350,000 viewers were watching this revelation unfold in real time. The comments were a blur of shock and outrage. His daughter. "This keeps getting worse. She discriminated against his family. The karma is unreal. Maya Thompson is brilliant. I've read her work." "Where is Maya now?" James asked, sensing there was more to this story. Marcus smiled for the first time since the ordeal began, and this time it was a warm, proud smile. "She's currently the lead architect on the new Sustainable Military Housing Initiative, the project that's replacing substandard housing at military bases around the world, including the facilities your company built, Ms. Blackwood." The irony was devastating. The young woman Vivian had rejected because she didn't fit was now in charge of fixing the problems Vivian's company had created. "The difference," Marcus continued, "is that Maya's designs prioritize the families who will live in these homes, not the profit margins of the contractors who build them." Vivian slumped in her seat, the full weight of her situation finally crushing her. She hadn't just made a mistake on an airplane, she had revealed a pattern of discrimination that affected both her personal interactions and her business practices. "Mr. Secretary?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to get off this plane." The cabin erupted in murmurs and whispers. Sophie's viewers exploded with reactions. "I want to make this right," Vivian continued. "I don't know how, but I want to try." Marcus studied her for a long moment. "Ms. Blackwood, words are easy. Actions matter. If you're serious about change, it starts with taking responsibility for everything, not just today's incident, but years of decisions that have affected real people's lives." "I understand," Vivian said, though her voice suggested she was still grappling with the magnitude of what that meant. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "Ma'am, if you're leaving the aircraft, you'll need to come with us to make a statement about the false reports you filed." "Yes," Vivian said, standing on unsteady legs. I'll face whatever consequences are appropriate." She gathered her expensive handbag and looked back at Marcus one more time. "Mr. Secretary, when I make my public statement, is there anything specific you'd like me to say?" Marcus considered this for a moment. "Tell the truth, Ms. Blackwood. All of it. Not because it will save your business, but because it might prevent someone else from making the same mistakes you've made." As Vivian walked toward the aircraft door, escorted by the Port Authority officers, the cabin remained silent, except for the continued buzz of phones recording and streaming every moment. Sophie finally spoke to her audience, her voice filled with awe. "I think we just witnessed one of the most incredible examples of consequences and accountability I've ever seen. This woman went from attacking a passenger to potentially losing everything, all because she couldn't see past her own prejudices." The aircraft door closed behind Vivian Blackwood with a soft thud that somehow sounded final, like the closing of a chapter in a book about power, prejudice, and the price of both. The moment the aircraft door sealed shut behind Vivian Blackwood, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin transformed completely. What had been a tension-filled arena became something closer to a sanctuary, a space where people could finally breathe freely after witnessing one of the most dramatic reversals of power in aviation history. Sophie's live stream was still running now, with an unprecedented 400,000 viewers. Major news networks were calling her phone continuously, desperate for exclusive access to the story that was already reshaping conversations about racism, power, and accountability across social media platforms worldwide. "I can't even process what just happened," Sophie said to her audience, her voice filled with genuine amazement. This woman literally chose to get off the plane rather than sit next to the man she'd been attacking. The irony is that he offered her a chance to stay to learn to be better, and she couldn't handle it. The comments on her stream were a mixture of celebration, analysis, and calls for continued accountability. Now investigate her company thoroughly. This is what real consequences look like. Secretary Thompson handled this with incredible grace. Vivian Blackwood will never recover from this. Maya Thompson must be so proud of her father. Captain Rodriguez returned to the cabin after coordinating with ground control and airline operations. The delay had created a ripple effect throughout the airport's schedule, but given the circumstances and the high-profile passenger involved, everyone from the airline executives to air traffic control was being remarkably accommodating. Mr. Secretary, Captain Rodriguez said, approaching Marcus with visible respect, "I want to personally apologize for what you experienced on my aircraft today. This is not representative of our airline's values or the standards we expect from our passengers." Marcus stood and shook the captain's hand. "Captain, you and your crew handled an impossible situation with professionalism and integrity. Elena especially showed courage in speaking up about issues that directly affect military families." Elena, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Secretary, my brother and his family live in housing built by Blackwood Properties. When I call him tonight and tell him what happened, when I tell him that someone is finally going to hold that company accountable, it's going to mean everything to him." Elena Marcus said gently, "I'd like you to have your brother contact my office directly. We're going to need detailed accounts from families who have been affected by substandard housing. Their voices need to be heard." James Patterson, who had been documenting everything on his social media platforms, approached the group. "Mr. Secretary, if I may, I think what happened here today represents something larger than one person's prejudice. This was a perfect case study in how bias affects decision-making at every level." "You're absolutely right," Marcus replied. "And that's why it's so important that people see the full consequences of those decisions. Prejudice isn't just about hurt feelings. It affects policy. It affects quality of life. It affects entire communities." Sophie finally ended her live stream after nearly 2 hours of continuous broadcasting. Her final viewer count exceeded 500,000 people, making it one of the most watched live streams in social media history. As she disconnected, she was immediately flooded with interview requests from CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, BBC, and news outlets from around the world. "Mr. Secretary," she said, approaching Marcus with her phone in her hand, "I know you probably can't do interviews right now, but I want you to know that what my followers witnessed today has already started conversations about discrimination that needed to happen." Marcus smiled at her. "Sophie, you did something very important today. You documented truth. You gave people a window into a reality that many prefer to ignore. That takes courage." While Flight 847 was finally beginning its taxi to the runway, the corporate consequences of Vivian Blackwood's actions were cascading across multiple industries and government agencies. Her humiliation had been broadcast to millions. But the real damage was just beginning. At Blackwood Properties headquarters in Manhattan, an emergency board meeting had been called within an hour of the live stream going viral. The company's stock price had dropped 18% in after-hours trading, and major investors were demanding immediate explanations. Richard Martinez, the company's chief financial officer, was fielding calls from Pentagon procurement officials, congressional oversight committees, and investigative journalists who smelled blood in the water. "Sir, we have the Secretary of Defense's office on line 1, his assistant announced. "They're requesting all documentation related to military housing contracts for the past 5 years. And line 2 is the Washington Post," she continued. "They want to discuss the allegations about substandard housing conditions. Line 3 is our largest institutional investor. They're discussing withdrawal of funding." The calls continued throughout the night. By morning, every major news outlet in the country would be running stories about Blackwood Properties, its questionable business practices, and its CEO's spectacular fall from grace. Back on the aircraft, Marcus was fielding his own calls from government officials who had been watching the situation unfold on social media. "Mr. Secretary?" His chief of staff's voice came through his secure phone. "The Pentagon is requesting guidance on how to handle the Blackwood Properties contracts. There are billions of dollars involved and thousands of military families affected. Initiate a full audit immediately," Marcus replied. "I want every project, every complaint, every quality control issue documented, and I want alternative contractors identified for critical housing needs. Sir, the White House Communications Office is asking if you plan to make a public statement about the incident." Marcus considered this. "Not about the personal aspects, but I will be making a statement about our commitment to quality housing for military families and our zero tolerance for discrimination in government contracting." As Flight 847 finally reached cruising altitude over the Pacific Ocean, the first-class cabin had settled into an almost surreal calm. Passengers were processing what they had witnessed, many of them continuing to share their experiences on social media, adding to the growing narrative about accountability and justice. Marcus had returned to his book, though he found it difficult to concentrate on The Art of War when he had just demonstrated its principles in real life. The chapter he was reading discussed the importance of understanding your enemy's weaknesses and using them strategically, advice that had proven remarkably relevant. Elena approached his seat with a glass of sparkling water and a lime, the same order he had requested hours earlier when the confrontation with Vivian was just beginning. "Mr. Secretary," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about what happened today, and I wanted you to know that you've given me hope." Marcus looked up from his book. "Hope for what, Elena?" "Hope that the system can work," she replied. "I've seen so many instances of discrimination and abuse of power get swept under the rug, but today I watched someone face real consequences for their actions. It matters." "Change is possible," Marcus agreed. "But it requires people like you to speak up when they see something wrong. Your courage today made a difference." Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently cruising at 41,000 feet with clear skies ahead. We should arrive in London right on schedule despite our delayed departure. I want to thank our passengers for their patience during our extended ground time in Los Angeles." The captain didn't mention the reason for the delay, but everyone on the aircraft knew. The story of Flight 847 was already becoming legend. James Patterson was working on his laptop drafting a detailed analysis of the incident for his company's blog. His post titled "Bias, Power, and Accountability Lessons from 30,000 Feet" would be shared over 1 million times in the following week. Sophie was responding to interview requests and messages of support from her followers. Her documentation of the incident had made her an overnight sensation, but more importantly, it had sparked conversations about discrimination and justice that were reverberating across social media platforms worldwide. The other passengers in first class were quiet, many of them still processing what they had witnessed. Some were business executives who recognized parallels between Vivian's behavior and situations they had encountered in corporate boardrooms. Others were frequent travelers who had seen discrimination on flights before, but had never witnessed such dramatic consequences. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter, Maya. "Dad, I just saw the news. I'm proud of how you handled yourself today. That woman has no idea that her rejection letter has been on my office wall for 3 years as motivation. See you tomorrow. Love you. Reading his daughter's message, Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about creating a world where talented people like Maya wouldn't face discrimination based on prejudice and ignorance. As the aircraft continued its journey across the Atlantic, the passengers of Flight 847 were unaware that they had been part of a moment that would be studied in business schools, discussed in diversity training programs, and remembered as an example of how accountability could emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. The flight attendants continued their service with renewed energy, knowing they had been part of something important. Elena, in particular, felt empowered by the validation that speaking truth to power could actually make a difference. Hours later, as London appeared on the horizon and the aircraft began its descent into Heathrow Airport, the passengers of Flight 847 knew they would never forget their journey. They had witnessed justice in real-time, accountability in action, and the power of social media to amplify truth and demand change. For Marcus Thompson, the flight had been a reminder of why he had dedicated his life to public service to protect and serve people who deserved dignity, respect, and fair treatment, regardless of their background or circumstances. For Vivian Blackwood, who was somewhere over the Atlantic on a different flight after her humiliating exit, the journey was far from over. Her real reckoning was just beginning, and the whole world would be watching to see whether she could transform her prejudice into genuine change, or whether she would become another cautionary tale about the price of discrimination in the modern age. 3 weeks after Flight 847 landed at London Heathrow, the investigation into Blackwood Properties had become one of the most comprehensive audits in Department of Defense contracting history. What began as a response to a viral airplane incident had evolved into a sweeping examination of military housing standards, contractor accountability, and the broader implications of discrimination in government contracting. Marcus Thompson sat in his Pentagon office reviewing the preliminary findings with a team of investigators, auditors, and military housing experts. The reports spread across his conference table painted a disturbing picture of profits prioritized over the welfare of service members and their families. Mr. Secretary Colonel Patricia Williams, the lead investigator, said as she opened the briefing folder, "What we've discovered goes far beyond the housing quality issues that were initially reported. This appears to be a pattern of discriminatory practices that affected both the families living in these facilities and the contractors competing for the work." The investigation had uncovered a web of problematic practices at Blackwood Properties. Substandard materials had been used in construction to maximize profit margins. Minority-owned subcontractors had been routinely excluded from bidding processes. Quality control inspections had been perfunctory at best, with serious issues documented but never adequately addressed. "The mold problems at Camp Pendleton are worse than Elena Vasquez initially reported," Colonel Williams continued. "We have documented cases of children developing chronic respiratory issues. The electrical problems at Fort Hood have caused 3 fires in the past year, thankfully without casualties. And the heating failures at bases in colder climates have forced families to use space heaters that pose additional safety risks." Marcus studied the photographs attached to the reports. Images of black mold covering apartment walls exposed wiring flooding from failed plumbing, and families living in conditions that would have been unacceptable in civilian housing. "How many families have been affected?" Marcus asked. "Approximately 12,000 military families across 15 installations," Colonel Williams replied. "That includes roughly 18,000 children." The scale of the problem was staggering. Each family represented a service member who had volunteered to protect America, and their families deserved safe, dignified housing in return. "What about the financial aspects?" Marcus asked. Major David Park, the DoD's chief financial auditor, stepped forward with another set of documents. "Mr. Secretary, our analysis shows that Blackwood Properties has overcharged the government by approximately $340 million over the past 5 years through inflated material costs, unnecessary change orders, and charges for work that was never completed to specification." Marcus felt a familiar anger building, but it was controlled, focused. This wasn't about personal vindication anymore. It was about institutional justice for thousands of families who had been failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. "I want every affected family contacted directly," Marcus ordered. "I want their experiences documented, their health concerns addressed, and their housing situations improved immediately. This isn't just about accountability, it's about making sure these families get what they deserve." Elena Vasquez, who had been invited to provide testimony as part of the investigation, sat across from the Pentagon team in a video conference from Los Angeles. Her brother, Sergeant Miguel Vasquez, was with her, along with 3 other military families who had been living in Blackwood Properties housing. "Mr. Secretary, Elena said Miguel wants to show you something." The camera shifted to show Sergeant Vasquez holding up a photograph taken in his base housing apartment. The image showed extensive black mold covering an entire bedroom wall. "Sir Sergeant Vasquez said this is where my 5-year-old daughter sleeps. We've reported this mold issue 6 times over the past year. Each time Blackwood sends someone to spray bleach on the wall and paint over it. Within a month, it's back worse than before." "The underlying moisture problem was never addressed," Elena explained. "The contractors would do surface fixes to pass inspections, but they never invested in the proper remediation that would actually solve the problem." Marcus made notes as each family shared their experiences. Stories of housing that looked presentable during initial inspections, but deteriorated rapidly due to substandard materials and poor construction practices. Tales of complaints that were ignored or minimized. Accounts of families having to choose between speaking up about problems and potentially jeopardizing their military careers. The most frustrating part, said Staff Sergeant Rebecca Torres, another affected family member, was feeling like we had no recourse. "When you're military, you can't just move to another apartment. You live where they assign you, and when the housing is substandard, you feel trapped." Meanwhile, at London Heathrow Airport, the viral story of Flight 847 was having immediate real-world consequences. Vivian Blackwood, who had taken a different flight to London after her dramatic exit from the original aircraft, was met at immigration by UK Border Force officers and a team of journalists who had been tracking the story. The British authorities were investigating whether her behavior on the aircraft constituted a hate crime under UK law, which had stricter provisions about racial discrimination than many U.S. states. Her comments had been recorded and broadcast to millions of people, creating a permanent digital record of discriminatory language. Ms. Blackwood, the lead immigration officer, said as she was escorted to a private interview room, "We need to discuss the incident that occurred on Flight 847. Your behavior as described in multiple witness accounts and recorded in social media broadcasts raises concerns about potential violations of the Public Order Act." Vivian, who looked haggard and exhausted after days of non-stop media attention and legal consultations, could only nod silently. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled, her perfect makeup was smeared, and her air of invincibility had completely evaporated. Back in the United States, the consequences were escalating rapidly. The Blackwood Properties Board of Directors had called an emergency meeting within hours of the viral video emerging. By the end of that meeting, Vivian had been suspended as CEO pending a full investigation into both her personal conduct and the company's business practices. The company's stock price had dropped 45% in 3 days of trading. Major institutional investors were pulling their funding. The company's credit rating had been downgraded, making it difficult to secure financing for ongoing projects. Most critically, the Department of Defense had suspended all payments to Blackwood Properties, pending the audit results, creating an immediate cash flow crisis that threatened the company's survival. Marcus's daughter, Maya, who was leading the Sustainable Military Housing Initiative, found herself in an unexpectedly prominent position as media outlets sought expert commentary on military housing standards and the contracting process. "The problem with companies like Blackwood Properties," Maya explained in an interview with CNN, "is that they treat government contracts like guaranteed profit centers rather than sacred trusts. When you're building homes for military families, every corner you cut, every standard you ignore, affects real people who have dedicated their lives to serving our country. The interviewer asked about her personal connection to the story. Dr. Thompson, we understand that you were rejected for an internship by Blackwood Properties several years ago. How does it feel to now be leading the effort to replace their work? Maya smiled calmly. Justice has a way of coming full circle. I'm not motivated by revenge. I'm motivated by the opportunity to do this right, to build housing that honors the service and sacrifice of military families. 6 months after the Flight 847 incident, the transformation of military housing standards had become a model for government accountability and contractor oversight. Marcus had used the national attention from the incident to push through comprehensive reforms that had been stalled in bureaucracy for years. The new standards required all military housing contractors to submit to regular, unannounced inspections. Quality control measures included direct feedback from military families with anonymous reporting processes to prevent retaliation. Contractors who failed to meet standards faced immediate suspension and financial penalties. Most importantly, the bidding process had been restructured to prioritize quality and accountability over low-cost bids and political connections. Minority-owned businesses were given enhanced opportunities to compete for contracts, and diversity requirements were built into all major housing projects. Elena Vasquez had accepted a position as a Pentagon liaison for military family housing concerns, using her military background and airline customer service experience to bridge the gap between policymakers and the families affected by housing decisions. Mr. Secretary Elena said during a briefing on the new housing standards, the feedback we're getting from military families is overwhelmingly positive. For the first time, they feel like their voices are being heard and their concerns are being addressed. James Patterson's company Bias Check AI had been contracted to develop algorithms that could identify discriminatory patterns in government contracting, helping to prevent future situations like the Blackwood Properties scandal. Sophie Martinez had parlayed her viral documentation of the Flight 847 incident into a career in investigative journalism specializing in social justice issues. Her follow-up reports on military housing conditions had won multiple awards and continued to pressure other contractors to improve their standards. The ripple effects extended beyond military housing. Airlines had implemented enhanced discrimination training for crew members with specific protocols for handling passenger conflicts that might involve bias or prejudice. The International Air Transport Association had developed new guidelines for passenger rights and crew intervention in discrimination incidents. Captain Rodriguez had been promoted to chief pilot and was leading the airline's new diversity and inclusion initiative. What we learned from Flight 847, he explained to a conference of aviation professionals, is that neutrality in the face of discrimination is actually complicity. Our crew members are now trained to recognize bias and take appropriate action to protect all passengers' dignity. The incident had also sparked broader conversations about discrimination in luxury service industries. High-end hotels, exclusive restaurants, and premium transportation services were implementing new training programs and accountability measures to prevent similar incidents. Blackwood Properties never recovered from the scandal. The company was forced into bankruptcy within 8 months of the Flight 847 incident, with its assets sold to cover outstanding debts and legal settlements with affected military families. Vivian Blackwood personally faced multiple lawsuits, including a federal civil rights case brought by the NAACP on behalf of Marcus Thompson and the military families affected by her company's discriminatory practices. She was also charged with filing false police reports, though those charges were eventually reduced to community service and mandatory bias education training. The financial settlements totaled over $200 million distributed among the military families who had been living in substandard housing and minority contractors who had been excluded from bidding processes. Marcus had insisted that the legal proceedings focus on remediation and reform rather than punishment. The goal isn't to destroy someone's life, he explained to reporters. The goal is to create a structure where this kind of discrimination becomes impossible. Vivian's personal fortune was largely depleted by the legal settlements and the collapse of her company. She was forced to sell her Manhattan townhouse, her Hampton estate, and most of her luxury possessions to cover her debts. The transformation was complete. The woman who had once felt entitled to eject a black man from first class was now living in a modest apartment, working a regular job, and attending court-ordered diversity training sessions. But perhaps most importantly, she was finally beginning to understand the real impact of her actions and the prejudices that had driven them. The new military housing projects led by Marcus Thompson's team became showcases for sustainable, high-quality construction that prioritized the needs and dignity of military families. The buildings featured advanced environmental controls to prevent mold, energy-efficient features to reduce costs, and community spaces that fostered connection among military families. These aren't just houses, Maya explained at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new housing complex at Fort Bragg. These are homes for heroes. Every detail was designed with respect for the people who will live here and the service they've provided to our country. The ceremony was attended by many of the military families who had been affected by the Blackwood property scandal, including Sergeant Vasquez and his family. His 5-year-old daughter, who had suffered from respiratory issues due to the mold in their previous housing, was thriving in their new safe home. As Marcus watched his daughter cut the ribbon on the new housing complex surrounded by grateful military families and dedicated public servants, he reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple flight to London. What started as a personal encounter with prejudice had become a catalyst for comprehensive reform, institutional accountability, and genuine change that would benefit thousands of families for generations to come. The incident on Flight 847 had proven that individual actions, when witnessed and documented, could create waves of change that transformed entire sectors. It demonstrated the power of social media to amplify truth and demand accountability. Most importantly, it showed that justice, when properly applied, could heal wounds and create structures that prevented future harm. The early morning London fog was lifting as Marcus Thompson walked through the gardens of his daughter's home in Hampstead, carrying his 8-month-old grandson, David, named after his grandfather. The baby gurgled contentedly as Marcus pointed out the various flowers and plants, maintaining a gentle conversation about everything and nothing. "And those are roses," David Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had diffused a crisis at 30,000 feet. "Your grandmother would have loved these. She always said roses reminded her that beautiful things require patience and care to flourish." Maya emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a comfortable sweater. At 31, she had become one of the most respected voices in sustainable architecture, but in this moment she was simply a daughter enjoying a peaceful morning with her father and son. "Dad," she said, settling onto a garden bench, "I got a call yesterday from the Pentagon. The Fort Hood housing project is 3 months ahead of schedule, and the family satisfaction ratings are the highest they've ever recorded for military housing." Marcus smiled, shifting the baby to his other arm. "Your mother would be so proud, Maya, not just of the professional success, but of the way you've turned that rejection letter into motivation to serve others." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching David explore the fascinating world of his own tiny fingers. The peace of the morning was a stark contrast to the media storm that had followed the Flight 847 incident, but that chaos had ultimately led to this moment, a family together, a wrong made right, and a legacy of positive change. "Have you heard anything about Vivian Blackwood lately?" Maya asked. Marcus nodded slowly. "Actually, I received a letter from her last week. Her court-ordered community service has been at a veterans shelter in Queens. She's been helping families navigate the VA Housing Assistance Program." "That's unexpected," Maya said. "People can change," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "Real change, the kind that comes from truly understanding the impact of your actions, is rare but possible. I hope she finds peace in service to others." The letter from Vivian had been handwritten, not typed by an assistant or crafted by lawyers. In it, she had described the humbling experience of working directly with homeless veterans and their families, many of whom were struggling with issues that her company's poor housing standards had contributed to. "Mr. Secretary," she had written, "I know that no apology can undo the harm I caused both to you personally and to the thousands of families affected by my company's failures. But I want you to know that your decision to offer me a choice rather than simply destroying me gave me the opportunity to understand the real meaning of service. I am trying every day to earn the forgiveness I don't deserve." Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Elena Vasquez was conducting her final flight as a commercial airline attendant. After 18 months in her new role at the Pentagon, she had been promoted to Director of Military Family Housing Advocacy, a position that allowed her to directly impact the lives of service members and their families. Her brother Miguel, now living in one of Maya Thompson's new housing developments at Camp Pendleton, had sent her a photo that morning, his 5-year-old daughter playing in a spotless modern bedroom with large windows and perfect air quality. The caption read, "Thank you for speaking up, sis. Emma hasn't had a single respiratory issue since we moved in." The ripple effects of Flight 847 continued to spread across multiple industries. Airlines had implemented comprehensive bias training programs, resulting in a measurable decrease in discrimination complaints. The hospitality industry had adopted similar measures after realizing that the principles applied beyond aviation. Sophie Martinez, now a correspondent for a major news network, was preparing a documentary about the long-term impact of viral social justice moments. Her investigation had revealed that the Flight 847 incident had been cited in over 300 academic papers, diversity training programs, and policy reform initiatives. What made this different? Sophie explained in her documentary narration was that it wasn't just about calling out bad behavior. It was about creating constructive consequences that led to meaningful change. The documentary would feature interviews with military families living in the new housing developments, minority contractors who had been given opportunities through the reformed bidding process, and aviation industry professionals who had implemented new protocols to prevent discrimination. James Patterson's Bias Check AI had evolved beyond its original scope, now working with government agencies, corporations, and educational institutions to identify and eliminate discriminatory patterns in everything from hiring practices to resource allocation. The Flight 847 algorithm, as his team called it, had become a case study in how artificial intelligence could be used to promote equity and justice rather than perpetuate existing biases. As autumn arrived in Washington, D.C., Marcus was preparing for what would likely be his final major initiative as Secretary of Defense. The comprehensive military housing reform that had begun with an airplane incident was being codified into permanent policy, ensuring that future administrations couldn't simply reverse the progress that had been made. Standing in the Roosevelt Room of the White House, Marcus addressed a gathering of military families, government officials, and media representatives who had come to witness the signing of the Military Family Housing Bill of Rights. 6 months ago, Marcus began his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I was reminded that dignity isn't about the uniform you wear or the title you hold. It's about the character you show when you think no one important is watching." He looked out at the audience, noting familiar faces from his journey. Elena Vasquez sat in the front row wearing her new Pentagon credentials. Maya Thompson was there with baby David, representing the next generation that would benefit from these reforms. Sophie Martinez was documenting the moment for her news network, her camera capturing history in the making. "The families represented in this room are service members and their children. They are the real heroes of this story," Marcus continued. They spoke truth to power when it would have been easier to remain silent. They demanded better not just for themselves, but for all the families who would come after them. The bill he was advocating for would create permanent oversight mechanisms, establish minimum quality standards for all military housing, and provide direct recourse for families facing substandard conditions. It would also mandate diversity requirements for all military contractors and create pathways for minority-owned businesses to compete fairly for government contracts. As the ceremony concluded, Marcus found himself thinking about the unexpected journey that had brought them all to this moment. A simple act of prejudice had revealed institutional problems that affected thousands of families. A viral moment had created the political pressure needed to implement comprehensive reform. Individual courage from people like Elena had provided the testimony needed to drive policy change. Walking out of the White House that evening, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Rodriguez. "Mr. Secretary, I wanted you to know that Flight 847 has been permanently redesignated as the Dignity Flight in our airline's training materials. Every new crew member learns about treating all passengers with respect, regardless of their appearance or perceived status." The message brought a smile to Marcus's face. Change, real change, happened not through grand gestures, but through thousands of individual decisions to do better, to be better, to demand better from the institutions that served the public. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the garden of his Arlington home video calling with Maya and David in London. The baby was crawling now, exploring his world with the fearless curiosity that Marcus hoped would characterize his generation's approach to justice and equality. "Dad," Maya said, "I have some news. The sustainable housing model we developed for the military is being adopted by 3 major civilian housing developers. The quality standards and community-focused design are going to benefit families far beyond the military. Your mother always said that the best victories are the ones that create opportunities for others," Marcus replied, watching his grandson discover the fascinating properties of a rubber duck. That evening, as Marcus prepared for bed, he reflected on a letter he'd received that day from a young black engineering student at Howard University. The student had written about feeling inspired by Maya's success and Marcus's example to pursue a career in public service. "Mr. Secretary," the letter read, "when I saw how you handled that situation on the airplane, how you turned hate into an opportunity for justice, I realized that leadership isn't about the power you hold. It's about how you use that power to lift others up." Looking out his bedroom window at the lights of Washington, D.C., Marcus thought about all the young people who would inherit the structures and institutions that his generation was working to improve. The incident on Flight 847 had been painful and infuriating, but it had also been transformative. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about punishment or revenge. True justice was about creating a world where dignity was universal, where character mattered more than appearance, and where everyone had the opportunity to contribute their talents without facing barriers based on prejudice or ignorance. His phone rang softly, a call from Maya telling him that David had said his first word, "Papa." As Marcus smiled and settled in for a long conversation with his family, he knew that the real victory wasn't what had happened to Vivian Blackwood or even the reforms that had been implemented. The real victory was that his grandson would grow up in a world where dignity was non-negotiable, where justice was possible, and where character truly was the measure of a person's worth. The story that had begun with hate and prejudice had ended with love, family, and hope for the future. And perhaps that was the most powerful transformation of all. If you've witnessed bias on a flight, in a workplace, or anywhere your presence was questioned, your story matters. Share it below. When we speak up, we create accountability. When we demand better, we build structures that protect everyone. This story shows us that one moment of courage, one person willing to document injustice, can change entire industries and protect thousands of families. Hit that like button if this story moved you. Subscribe and ring the bell for more incredible stories of justice served and karma delivered. Share this video with someone who needs to see that dignity isn't negotiable. and that standing up for what's right always matters. Because when we refuse to stay silent, we build a world where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve. What would you have done in Secretary Thompson's position? Let me know in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together we can make sure stories like this continue to inspire real change.